Picture, for a moment, a dusty Roman legionary at the end of a long day's march. His muscles ache, his feet are sore, and the Italian sun has left him parched. He doesn't reach for water. Instead, he pulls a clay flask from his pack and takes a long, deep drink of cheap, sharp, everyday wine. This wasn't a luxury reserved for emperors in their marble villas. This was the standard beverage for soldiers, laborers, and common citizens across the entire empire. Wine was as fundamental to daily Roman life as bread, a caloric staple, a safe source of hydration, and a small, daily comfort available to nearly everyone. And this fact leads us to a truly monumental question, one that challenges our modern assumptions about ancient economies. How did the Roman Empire, a civilization renowned for its staggering wealth, its opulent feasts, and its taste for the most extravagant luxuries, somehow crack the code on mass production so thoroughly that they could make wine affordable enough for even the poorest to drink it every single day? It seems like a paradox, doesn't it? A society of immense inequality, yet one that achieved a level of democratized access to what we would consider a specialty good that wouldn't be seen again for over 1,000 years. The answer is not found in a single secret recipe or one brilliant inventor. It's a sprawling story woven into the very fabric of Roman society, a tale of agricultural genius, ruthless economic pragmatism, and culinary innovation that was, in its own way, as revolutionary as the aqueducts and roads that defined their world. We are about to pull back the curtain on one of history's most impressive logistical achievements. We will journey into the sun-baked vineyards, the bustling ports, and the smoky taverns to unravel how Rome turned winemaking from an artisanal craft into an industrial-scale operation. We'll discover the clever, and sometimes shocking, methods they used to stretch their wine supplies, the global trade networks that made it possible, and the surprising flavors that filled the cups of millions. This is the hidden story behind the Roman Empire's most popular drink, a story of how a civilization built on conquest and engineering also mastered the art of making luxury affordable for the masses. To understand the sheer scale of this achievement, you first have to appreciate just how deeply wine was woven into the fabric of Roman existence. It was far more than a mere drink. It was a nutritional cornerstone, a social lubricant, and a political tool. Imagine a world where the water supply was often dangerous, a potential carrier of disease. For the vast majority of Romans, wine was the safe alternative. It was diluted with water and consumed throughout the day, from the first meal to the last, providing essential calories and hydration. This dependence was universal. In the grand triclinium of a senator's palace, fine Falernian wine, aged for decades, was a symbol of status and refined taste. But descend the social ladder, and you'd find the same basic reliance. The legionary on the frontier received a daily wine ration as part of his pay, a crucial morale booster that also sanitized his water. The dockworker in Ostia, the shopkeeper in Pompeii, the farmer tilling his field, all consumed wine as a daily necessity. Even slaves were given a regular allowance of the cheapest vin ordinaire. It was considered a fundamental cost of keeping the workforce functional and compliant. The Roman statesman Cato the Elder, a man notorious for his austerity, explicitly listed wine rations for slaves in his writings on farm management, treating it with the same practical importance as bread or clothing. This universal consumption created a cultural expectation that was almost impossible to overstate. To be Roman was to drink wine. To refuse it was seen as strange, even barbaric. The historian Tacitus, for instance, noted with disdain that Germanic tribes drank beer, a beverage Romans considered vastly inferior. This wasn't just a matter of taste, it was a marker of civilization itself. The affordability of wine, therefore, became a bedrock of imperial stability. The poet Juvenal famously quipped that the Roman populace only needed two things to keep them happy: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. But he was being poetic, not literal. In reality, that bread was almost always accompanied by a cup of cheap, acidic wine. A sudden shortage or a sharp price increase wouldn't just mean grumbling in the streets. It could trigger riots. The Roman state, through a complex system of trade, taxation, and agricultural policy, effectively subsidized this basic commodity. By ensuring that even the poorest citizen could afford their daily measure of wine, the empire bought a form of social peace, allowing it to project power across the known world without constant fear of unrest at its very core. The entire sprawling, magnificent, and often brutal edifice of Roman power rested, in part, on the empire's unique ability to put a cup of wine in the hand of nearly every one of its subjects. So how do you make a luxury item affordable for tens of millions of people? You start at the very root, by fundamentally altering the land itself to produce on a scale that was previously unimaginable. The Roman approach to viticulture was less about delicate, artisanal care and more about a relentless, systematic conquest of the countryside. Long before a single amphora was filled, the empire was already engineering the solution in the sprawling, sun-drenched vineyards that stretched from the hills of central Italy to the river valleys of Gaul and the sunny coasts of Hispania. This was agriculture as an industrial enterprise. Roman landowners, from wealthy senators to ambitious freedmen, understood that the path to wealth was not in producing a small quantity of exquisite wine for the elite, but in flooding the market with a vast ocean of decent, drinkable wine for the masses. They achieved this through a ruthless trifecta of scale, standardization, and a brutally efficient labor force. Consider the transformation of the Italian peninsula. In regions like Latium and Campania, where the rich volcanic soil was ideal for grapes, the landscape was systematically reorganized. Forests were cleared, hillsides were terraced, and vast tracts of land were dedicated to the vine. But Italy alone could not quench the empire's thirst. As the legions advanced, so too did the vine. In conquered territories like modern-day France and Spain, the Romans didn't just establish military outposts, they established agricultural colonies. They identified land with the right climate and soil, and they replicated their farming methods with relentless consistency. The province of Gallia Narbonensis, in what is now southern France, became so famous for its high-volume, affordable wines that it eventually began to outcompete Italian producers, a testament to the success of the Roman model even when applied abroad. This was a true globalization of taste and production, creating a decentralized network of supply that made the entire system more resilient and kept prices stable across vast distances. To manage these colossal estates, Roman farmers didn't rely on guesswork or tradition. They operated from detailed, pragmatic manuals that read more like modern engineering textbooks than pastoral poetry. The most famous of these was written by Cato the Elder, a hard-nosed statesman who valued profit above all else. His work, De Agricultura, is a fascinating window into the mindset behind this agricultural revolution. Cato provides excruciatingly specific instructions for every aspect of vineyard management. He dictates the exact dimensions for planting vines, the precise number of cuttings per acre, and the most efficient tools for every job. He even details the optimal construction of wine presses, and storage dolia, the massive ceramic jars buried in the ground that served as the fermentation tanks of the ancient world. This standardization was absolutely critical. It meant that an estate manager in Hispania and one in Campania were following the same proven playbook, eliminating wasteful experimentation and maximizing yield per unit of land. It was this repeatable, scalable system that turned winemaking from a localized craft into a reproducible industrial process. And none of this would have been possible without the immense and often grim engine of the Roman economy, slave labor. The endless wars of conquest provided a continuous supply of human capital, and these captives were put to work in the vineyards that supplied the empire. Cotto's manual is chillingly clear on this point. He coldly calculates the number of slaves needed for a given size of vineyard, outlines their meager rations of food and wine, and instructs the villicus, the farm manager, to sell off any slave who becomes too old or infirm to work. This wasn't personal cruelty, it was economic calculus. By leveraging this massive, unfree labor force, landowners could keep their operational costs astonishingly low. The overhead for producing a single amphora of wine was minimal when the primary workforce required no wages, only basic subsistence. This brutal efficiency is the unspoken foundation of Roman wine's affordability. The cheap wine that sustained the legionary and comforted the common citizen was, in a very real sense, a product of conquest twice over, first of the land that grew the grapes, and then of the people who were forced to tend them. But what kind of grape could possibly fuel such a massive, relentless system? If you're picturing the delicate, thin-skinned Pinot Noir or elegant Cabernet Sauvignon grapes that grace the finest bottles in a modern wine shop, you'd be looking in the wrong place entirely. The backbone of the Roman wine industry was not a grape of finesse or complexity. It was a workhorse, a botanical engine of production chosen for one reason above all others: brute force reliability. The Romans were cultivating subspecies of Vitis vinifera, the same species that gives us all wine grapes today, but they selected for entirely different traits. Think less of a pampered racehorse and more of a sturdy, unkillable draft ox. The ideal Roman grapevine was one that could thrive in a variety of soils, resist the blights and pests that could wipe out a harvest, and most importantly, produce a colossal yield of fruit year after year after year. Flavor was a secondary, almost tertiary concern. What mattered was volume and survival. These grapes would be almost unrecognizable to a contemporary winemaker. While we can't point to a single modern variety and say, this is it, we have strong clues from historical texts and genetic studies. They were likely ancestors of or very similar to obscure, rustic varieties that still survive in isolated corners of Italy, today grapes like the Piedirasso of Campania or the Gagliapo of Calabria. Imagine grapes with thick, tannic skins, packed with robust flavors, and a bracing, mouth-puckering acidity. They were built to withstand long journeys and rough handling. The wine they produced straight from the press was not something you would particularly enjoy drinking. The ancient writers themselves often describe raw, new wine as harsh, astringent, and intensely sour. Pliny the Elder, in his vast encyclopedia of Roman knowledge, lamented that many wines were naturally harsh and required significant intervention to become even remotely palatable. This was the fundamental raw material, a rough, acidic, and powerfully tannic liquid that was cheap and easy to produce in mind-boggling quantities. The real magic, the alchemy that turned this rustic foundation into the daily drink of millions, happened not in the vineyard, but after the harvest. Now, with these vast vineyards of hardy grapes producing a veritable flood of fruit, we come to the true moment of transformation, the harvest and the press. This is where the Roman pursuit of efficiency became a precise, almost mathematical art, and where the social stratification of the empire became physically inscribed into the very liquid itself. The process began with the harvest, a frantic, labor-intensive period where entire communities of slaves and seasonal workers would descend upon the vineyards, stripping the vines with a speed that prioritized volume over gentleness. The grapes were then gathered and unceremoniously dumped into a large, shallow trough, often carved from a single massive log or stone. Here, the first stage of juice extraction began, not with a press, but with human feet. Teams of workers would tread the grapes for hours, their bare feet crushing the fruit and releasing the free-run juice. While this might sound rustic or even unhygienic to us, it was actually a relatively gentle method. The feet provided enough pressure to burst the skins, but avoided crushing the bitter seeds and stems to excess, resulting in a juice that was cleaner and of a higher quality. This initial, free-flowing liquid was the most prized. It was collected and would become what was known as vinum primarium, the first pressing wine. This was the nectar of the elite, a wine with more color, body, and fruit character, destined for the tables of senators, wealthy merchants, and the imperial court. It was the closest the Romans got to a modern premium wine. But the story of Roman wine affordability doesn't lie with this first, luxurious pressing. The real secret, the economic engine that filled the amphorae for the masses, was what happened next. After the treading was complete, the remaining pulp, a soggy mass of skins, seeds, and stems still saturated with juice, was not discarded. That would have been an unthinkable waste in a system built on maximizing every single asset. Instead, this leftover mash was gathered up, placed into a much more formidable device, the lever press or the screw press. This is where the true volume was unlocked. The press applied immense mechanical force, squeezing every last drop of liquid from the crushed remains. The juice that emerged from this second pressing was fundamentally different. It was thinner, cloudier, and loaded with harsh tannins extracted from the grape skins, seeds, and stems that had been ground down under the tremendous pressure. It was also darker and more astringent, a rougher, brasher, and significantly more bitter liquid. This was the vinum secundarium, the second pressing wine. And still, the relentless pursuit of yield was not over. In many cases, the solid cake of pomace left after the second pressing might even be broken up, mixed with a little water, and pressed a third time. This produced a thin, acidic, and barely palatable liquid called vinum tertiarium, or sometimes laura. This was the absolute bottom of the barrel, a drink so rough it was almost exclusively reserved for the lowest-tier slaves, or used as a base for pasca, the vinegar-water mixture that was a staple for soldiers and the very poor. Think of this entire pressing process as a perfect metaphor for the Roman economy itself, a highly efficient, multi-tiered system that meticulously sorted its products and its people by quality and class. The single harvest of one vineyard could produce 3 distinct social strata of wine, all from the same grapes. The elite enjoyed the pure, unforced juice. The vast populace drank the product of mechanical extraction, and the very bottom rung of society consumed the diluted dregs. It was this ruthless, systematic approach to maximizing yield that provided the sheer volume necessary to make wine affordable. By ensuring that not a single drop of potential alcohol was wasted, Roman producers effectively created 2 or even 3 products from one raw material. with the second pressing forming the overwhelming bulk of the wine that circulated in the taverns and markets of the empire. But after all that effort to press every last drop from the grapes, the Romans then performed their most fundamental act of cost-cutting, one so universal it defined their entire drinking culture. They added water. To our modern palate, the idea of taking a bottle of wine and intentionally diluting it seems almost sacrilegious, a way to ruin a carefully crafted product. For the Romans, it was the absolute norm, a practice so ingrained that drinking wine straight was considered the mark of a barbarian or an alcoholic. This wasn't a mere preference for a lighter beverage. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy of volumetric expansion. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a factory finding a way to turn 1 unit of a product into 3 or 4 units for sale, dramatically slashing the price per serving and making it accessible to a vastly larger market. The ratios they used were often staggering to our modern sensibilities. While the precise mixture could vary depending on the occasion, the quality of the wine, and personal taste, common practice involved diluting 1 part of wine with 3, 4, or even 5 parts of water. A strong, astringent second pressing wine might be cut with a larger amount of water to make it palatable, while a finer first pressing wine might be mixed with a more modest amount for a senator's banquet. This simple act of mixing was a powerful economic lever. A single amphora of wine, which might hold about 25 liters, could be transformed into 100 liters or more of a drinkable, hydrating beverage. This single practice effectively reduced the cost of a serving of wine to a fraction of its base price, placing it firmly within the financial reach of soldiers, laborers, and even slaves. The entire Roman wine economy was, in a very real sense, built upon this foundation of dilution. Beyond pure economics, this practice was deeply rooted in practical health and cultural sophistication. The Romans were acutely aware that their water supplies, especially in a dense, sprawling city like Rome, could be contaminated. Mixing wine with water, particularly the more acidic, tannic wines that were common, acted as a rudimentary form of purification. The alcohol and acidic compounds in the wine could help kill or inhibit some of the harmful bacteria in the water, making the resulting mixture far safer to drink than plain water from a public fountain or a well. This made diluted wine the standard beverage at every meal for every class. It was the Roman equivalent of a bottled water industry and an energy drink company combined into one essential daily product. The ritual of mixing also held profound social significance. At a formal dinner party, the act was not left to a servant in the kitchen. It was a central ceremony performed by the host himself at the table. The wine and water were mixed in a large, ornate bowl called a crater, from which servants would then fill the guests' cups. This was a public demonstration of the host's generosity and control. He determined the strength of the wine, setting the tone for the evening's festivities. A weaker mix might signify a more intellectual or serious gathering, while a stronger ratio could signal a raucous party. To bypass this ritual and drink your wine marum, or unmixed, was seen as a savage and uncivilized act. The Greek historian Plutarch even suggested that the mythical Amazons drank their wine unmixed, using this as proof of their wild and unnatural nature. So, in diluting their wine, the Romans weren't just being cheap. They were performing their identity as civilized people, distinguishing themselves from the barbarians who lacked the self-control and social grace to temper their consumption. This one simple act perfectly encapsulates the Roman approach to wine. It was a substance to be managed, controlled, and optimized, both for the health of the body and the stability of the state, ensuring that every citizen, from the highest to the lowest, could afford their daily share of this vital, civilization-defining liquid. And with massive quantities of rough, diluted wine now being produced, the Romans faced another monumental challenge. How do you package and ship this ocean of liquid across the empire without the cost of the container itself making the final product unaffordable? Their brilliant, ubiquitous solution was a piece of pottery so perfectly engineered for its purpose that it became the shipping container of the ancient world, the terracotta amphora. Forget about the delicate, hand-blown glass bottles we associate with wine today. The Roman amphora was all about rugged, standardized, and breathtakingly cheap mass production. These were the cardboard boxes and plastic crates of their time, designed for one primary mission: to get wine from the producer to the consumer as efficiently and inexpensively as possible. The secret to their affordability lay in their method of manufacture. While the earliest amphorae were built entirely by hand, Roman potters quickly industrialized the process. In workshops scattered across the empire, from the outskirts of Rome itself to major port cities, artisans used reusable molds to shape the bodies of these vessels. A potter would throw the neck and rim on a fast-spinning wheel for consistency, but the bulbous body was often formed by pressing clay into a pre-made mold. This hybrid technique combined the speed of molding with the structural integrity of wheel throwing. It meant a single workshop, manned by a team of skilled potters and their assistants, could churn out hundreds of identical amphorae in a single day. This was pottery as a factory line operation, and it drove the cost of each individual vessel down to a minuscule fraction of the value of the wine it carried. The standardization was so precise that modern archaeologists can often identify the specific workshop and even the time period an amphora was made just by analyzing its shape, thickness, and the composition of its clay. This uniformity was not just an aesthetic choice. It was a logistical masterstroke. The classic wine amphora was a tall, tapered vessel with a pointed bottom, two sturdy handles, and a narrow neck sealed with a cork or a blob of clay and pitch. Every part of this design served a clear, practical function. The pointed base was genius. It allowed the amphorae to be stacked upright by leaning them against each other in the curved hulls of ships, creating a stable, interlocking cargo that minimized shifting during a stormy sea voyage. On land, this same pointed end could be easily plunged into a patch of soft earth or a specially designed rack in a warehouse, holding the amphora securely upright for storage. The two handles made them perfectly balanced for a worker to carry, one in each hand, and the narrow neck reduced the wine's exposure to air, helping to preserve it slightly longer during transit. This wasn't just a container. It was a piece of high-performance logistics equipment, refined over centuries to be as efficient as humanly possible. Consider the sheer scale of this system. A single medium-sized merchant ship wrecked off the coast of France, known as the Madrague de Jean's wreck, was found to have carried an estimated 6,000 to 7,000 amphorae, most of them filled with Italian wine. That's one ship on one journey. Multiply that by the thousands of ships plying the Mediterranean, and you begin to grasp the tidal wave of pottery that was in constant circulation. And this is where the final, crucial piece of the affordability puzzle clicks into place. The amphora was often a one-way container. While some high-quality vessels might be rinsed and reused locally, the vast majority were simply too cumbersome and cheap to ship back empty to their point of origin. In Rome, the ultimate consumer market, this created literal mountains of discarded pottery. The Monte Testaccio in Rome, a hill over 100 feet tall, is not made of earth or rock, but is an artificial mound composed entirely of millions upon millions of broken amphorae, carefully dumped and layered over centuries. This pottery mountain stands as a silent, monumental testament to the scale of Roman consumption. The fact that it was more economically viable to produce a new, cheap amphora for each shipment than to bear the cost of returning the empty one tells you everything you need to know about the economics of the system. The low price of the packaging was a fundamental, non-negotiable part of the equation, ensuring that the wine which sustained the legionary and quenched the thirst of the common citizen remained a commodity they could afford, day after day, across the vast expanse of the empire. Of course, a system that produced such staggering volumes of cheap wine was bound to encounter a major, predictable problem: spoilage. With so much wine in circulation, how did the Romans deal with the constant threat of entire shipments turning sour? The answer reveals yet another layer of their economic brilliance, where nothing, not even failure, was ever truly wasted. In our modern world, a bottle of wine that has turned to vinegar is a disappointment, something to be poured down the drain. But in ancient Rome, a vinegar-like wine, known as acetum, wasn't a disaster. It was a distinct and valuable commodity with a thriving market of its own. They had effectively industrialized the entire life cycle of wine, turning even its decay into a useful product. This transformation happened naturally and frequently. The Romans did not have access to modern sterilization techniques or airtight seals. While amphorae were sealed with cork or clay, the fermentation process was not always fully controlled, and exposure to oxygen during transport or storage would invite a particular type of bacteria, Acetobacter, to feast on the alcohol in the wine. These microscopic invaders would convert the ethanol into acetic acid, turning the wine into what we would call wine vinegar. A sharp, acidic aroma and a distinctly sour taste were the telltale signs that a batch had gone off. But instead of viewing this as a total loss, Roman merchants and households saw it as a simple change of state, like water turning to ice. The acetum was simply diverted from the drinking supply and channeled into a variety of other essential roles. One of the most important uses for this sour wine was in the Roman kitchen, where it functioned as the primary acidic component in cooking, much like vinegar is used today. The famous Roman condiment garum, a fermented fish sauce, was often balanced and enhanced with a splash of acetum to create vibrant dressings and marinades. Apicius, the author of the only surviving Roman cookbook, calls for sour wine in numerous recipes, using it to tenderize tough cuts of meat, to deglaze pans for creating simple sauces, and to add a bright, tangy note to vegetable dishes and fruit preparations. It was the fundamental souring agent that cut through the richness of olive oil and the saltiness of preserved foods, forming the backbone of the Roman palate alongside garum and salt. By creating a built-in, low-cost market for spoiled wine in their own pantries, Romans ensured that a vast quantity of what would otherwise be a total loss was still economically productive. Beyond the kitchen, acetum played a crucial role in food preservation, a vital necessity in a world without refrigeration. Its high acidity created an environment where spoilage bacteria couldn't thrive. Vegetables, fruits, and even certain types of fish and meat would be submerged in or packed with sour wine to extend their edible life, especially for long sea voyages or military campaigns. This practice was so common that it was effectively the Roman equivalent of canning or pickling. The Roman army, always concerned with logistics, would have relied heavily on acidum not just as a drink for the soldiers, but as a preservative for their other rations, making spoiled wine a strategic military supply. Furthermore, this acidic liquid had household uses that stretched far beyond food. It was used as a mild disinfectant for cleaning surfaces and even for washing wounds, capitalizing on its antimicrobial properties. Pliny the Elder wrote about its use in various medical preparations and as a cleaning agent, highlighting its versatility. This multi-purpose utility meant that a household never had to truly throw anything away. A spoiled amphora of wine could be redirected to the kitchen, the pantry, or the medicine chest, ensuring its economic value was fully realized. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, this sour wine, acidum, was still consumed as a beverage, but for a very different purpose and by a different segment of the population. While the finer, properly preserved wine was diluted with water for drinking, acidum was mixed with water to create a thirst-quenching, low-alcohol drink called pasca. This was the true drink of the common soldier, the urban laborer, and the very poor. It was incredibly cheap, often provided for free at public fountains in cities, and it was remarkably effective. The acidic tang of the pasca helped to mask the taste of questionable water, and the acidity, once again, would have helped to kill some harmful pathogens, making it a safer hydration option than plain water. For a legionary on a long march under the blistering sun, a sip of pasca from his canteen was not a gourmet experience. It was a functional, revitalizing beverage that quenched his thirst and helped keep him healthy. The economic beauty of this system is breathtaking. A single batch of wine could follow a profitable journey from a prized beverage for the affluent to a cooking staple for the middle class, and finally, in its soured state, to a hydrating, safe drink for the masses and the military. This cascading use case model minimized waste to an absolute minimum, ensuring that every drop of wine, whether fine, common, or spoiled, contributed to the economic and social machinery of the empire. Yet, even with dilution and a robust system for repurposing vinegar, the reality of mass-produced Roman wine remained stark. The journey from a provincial vineyard to a crowded tavern in Rome was long and arduous, and much of the cheap second-press wine that formed the bulk of the supply was often teetering on the edge of spoilage or had already developed sharp, unpleasant flavors. To make this rough, frequently unstable product not just drinkable but actually desirable to the masses, the Romans employed a final, crucial layer of ingenuity. They became masters of the blend. The act of drinking wine was rarely about tasting the unadulterated juice of the grape. It was about experiencing a crafted concoction, a flavorful mask designed to hide a multitude of sins. Think of the Roman tavern keeper not as a sommelier, but as an alchemist or a perfumer, his shelves lined not with bottles, but with jars of herbs, spices, resins, and syrups, each one a tool to correct, enhance, or completely transform the liquid in his amphorae. The most common and beloved corrective was honey. In a world without refined sugar, honey was the primary sweetener, and it was deployed with a heavy hand. A cheap, acidic wine that made you wince could be instantly tamed by stirring in a generous dollop of honey, creating a drink known as mulsum. This wasn't a rare delicacy, it was a standard offering, often served as the first course at a meal to stimulate the appetite. The sweetness would cover up the aggressive tartness of a wine that had started to turn, balancing the acidity and making it far more approachable for the average drinker. Beyond honey, a vast pantry of other flavorings was routinely employed. Herbs like thyme, rosemary, and saffron were steeped in wine, not just for their aromatic qualities, but for their perceived medicinal benefits. Spices such as black pepper, myrrh, and even costus, an aromatic root from India, were ground and added, creating complex spiced wines that bore a closer resemblance to modern vermouth or mulled wine than to a classic Cabernet. Resins, particularly pine resin, were another ubiquitous additive. While the Greeks are most famous for ricina, the Romans also used resin to line the interiors of amphorae, which helped to seal the porous clay and, as a byproduct, imparted a distinct, pungent flavor that consumers came to expect. For a populous drinking wine that was often one step away from vinegar, these strong, masking flavors were not a matter of preference. They were a necessity. They provided a consistent and predictable taste profile that could override the inherent instability and variable quality of the base product. But this pragmatic approach to flavor correction had a dark and terrifying side, one that leads us to the most infamous additive in the Roman culinary arsenal, lead. The Romans were famously unaware of the neurotoxin's dangers, and they discovered that by boiling down sour wine in lead pots or lead-lined bronze kettles, they could create a sweet, syrup-like concentrate called sapa or defrutum. The chemistry is chillingly simple. The acetic acid in the wine would react with the lead metal, forming lead acetate, a compound that is, paradoxically, intensely sweet. A small amount of this syrup, stirred into a harsh, sour wine, would not only mask the acidity, but would impart a pleasant sweetness that made the wine incredibly appealing. This made sapa a highly valued commodity, a secret weapon for wine merchants looking to move low-quality stock. What the Romans couldn't have known was that they were slowly poisoning their population. Lead acetate is highly soluble and is readily absorbed by the body, leading to a cumulative lead poisoning. The symptoms, abdominal pain, constipation, mood disorders, infertility, and cognitive decline, have even been cited by some historians as a potential contributing factor in the political instability and erratic behavior of later Roman emperors and the elite, who would have consumed the sweetened, high-quality wines most frequently. For the common person drinking cheaper, often doctored wine, the exposure, while likely lower, was still a constant and insidious health risk. This practice is a sobering reminder that the drive for affordability and palatability in a mass-market product could have unintended, catastrophic consequences, blurring the line between culinary innovation and a public health crisis. Even the efficiency of turning spoiled wine into vinegar had its limits within the rigid Roman social hierarchy, creating a stark divide in what people actually drank. If the standard, diluted second-press wine was the beverage of the common citizen, and acidum was its useful, soured byproduct, then the drinks known as Posca and Laura existed in a category all their own, the absolute bottom of the barrel, both literally and socially. These were not just cheap alternatives. They were distinct, officially recognized concoctions designed to extract every last bit of economic value from the winemaking process and provide a basic, functional hydration for those at the very margins of society. Understanding them is to understand the final, unshakable foundation of the Roman wine economy, a system that ensured no one, not even a destitute beggar or a chain gang slave, was ever left without their assigned portion of the empire's most vital liquid. First, let's consider Posca. You might recall it being mentioned as a mixture of sour wine and water, but its identity was more specific, and its role more profound than that simple description suggests. While any household could make a version of it, true Posca was an institutional drink, a standardized ration central to the functioning of the Roman state's two most powerful engines, the army and the urban dole. For the legionary, Pascha was not an occasional refreshment. It was a daily staple, as fundamental to his kit as his gladius or his sandals. His canteen, often made of wood or leather, would be filled with this sharp, acidic brew. The genius of Pascha for military use was its sheer practicality. By using wine that had already turned to acidum, the army was utilizing a product that was otherwise nearly worthless, keeping costs astonishingly low. The acidity of the vinegar acted as a preservative, preventing the water it was mixed with from spoiling too quickly during long marches under the hot sun. More importantly, it was a safety measure. The acidic environment was hostile to many of the waterborne pathogens that could decimate an army camp, making Pascha a safer bet than drinking from a suspicious stream or a stagnant pond near a fortification. For the soldier, the taste was secondary to the function. It quenched his thirst and helped keep him on his feet. This practice was so ingrained that the Gospels of the New Testament mention a Roman soldier offering Jesus a sponge soaked in Pascha while he was on the cross, a detail that underscores its ubiquity as the standard drink of the rank and file military. In the sprawling, crowded metropolis of Rome, Pascha played an equally vital role as a tool of social control. The city's poor, living in cramped, fire-prone insulae apartment blocks with no access to clean cooking or storage facilities, relied on a vast network of public fountains and street vendors. At these fountains, alongside the life-giving water, it was common for Pascha to be available, either for a minuscule coin or sometimes for free. Street vendors would sell it from large jars, much like a modern food truck sells soda. For a manual laborer heading to work on the docks or a messenger running through the city's streets, a cup of Pascha was a quick, cheap way to rehydrate. Its sharp, vinegar-like tang was often tempered with a sprinkle of fragrant herbs like mint or cumin, making it more palatable and freshening the breath. This public provision of Pascha was a deliberate policy. By ensuring the urban poor had access to this safe, cheap, and slightly caloric beverage, the Roman state prevented the unrest that could arise from thirst and disease. It was a brilliantly cynical calculation. Provide the absolute minimum necessary to maintain public health and order, using a product that cost the state almost nothing. The drink of the mighty legions conquering Gaul was, in the city itself, the drink of the conquered and the destitute, a perfect illustration of the circular and hierarchical nature of Roman society. But if Pascha represented the bottom rung of commercially viable drinks, then Laura existed in a sub-basement all its own. This beverage takes the Roman principle of maximizing yield to its absolute, almost absurd conclusion. Remember the pomace, the solid mass of grape skins, seeds, and stems left over after the first, second, and even third pressings. For most modern winemakers, this is waste, destined for the compost heap or, at best, to be distilled into spirits like grappa. For the Romans, it was a resource with one final drop of value to be squeezed out. Laura was produced by taking this spent, dry pomace, dumping it into a vat, and soaking it in water for a day or more. The mixture would then be pressed one last, futile time to extract a thin, cloudy, and nearly colorless liquid. The resulting drink was pitifully weak, with an alcohol content so low it was negligible. Its flavor would have been overwhelmingly watery, with a harsh, bitter aftertaste from the broken seeds and stems, and a faint, ghostly memory of grape flavor. The consumers of Laura were not soldiers or the urban poor, but the very lowest class of all, rural slaves, particularly those working on the vast agricultural estates. The agricultural writers Cato and Columella are explicit about this. They instruct farm managers to provide lora to the chain gangs of slaves who work the fields, often specifying it as their ration during the winter months when other work was scarce. This was not about hydration or health. It was about bare subsistence. Providing lora was a way to fulfill the technical obligation of giving the slaves their wine ration at the absolute lowest possible cost. It offered minimal calories and a psychological reminder of their place in the world. Drinking lora was a daily ritual of subjugation, a tangible sign that you were at the very end of the economic line, consuming the literal dregs of an industry that fed an empire. The existence of lora completes the picture of a ruthlessly efficient, cascading system where a single harvest of grapes could produce a dozen different social experiences, from the fine vinum primarium of the senator to the standard vinum secundarium of the citizen, to the functional posca of the soldier, and finally to the desolate lora of the enslaved field hand. In this hierarchy of beverages, we see the entire Roman social order reflected in a cup, a stark reminder that their genius for affordability was built upon a foundation of relentless extraction that left nothing, and no one behind. But this entire intricate system, from the hardy grapes to the final sip of lora, relied on a much larger, empire-wide economic strategy that redirected the very flow of sustenance across the Mediterranean. To truly grasp the affordability of Roman wine, you have to look beyond the vineyard and the tavern, and into the granaries of Rome itself. The empire achieved its staggering volume of wine production through a policy of deliberate agricultural specialization, a grand bargain orchestrated by the state that fundamentally reshaped the Italian countryside. The key to this transformation wasn't a new grapevine or a better press. It was grain, specifically the massive, state-subsidized import of millions of tons of cheap wheat from the provinces of Egypt and North Africa. This was the famous annona system, a public grain dole that began as a form of welfare and evolved into the central pillar of Rome's economic stability. By guaranteeing a steady, cheap supply of bread for the restless urban population of the city of Rome, the imperial government accomplished something revolutionary. It freed Italian farmers from the age-old burden of subsistence agriculture. For centuries, a farmer on the Italian peninsula had to use his most fertile land to grow wheat and barley to feed his family and local community. This was a precarious existence, vulnerable to drought, blight, and invasion. But as Rome conquered the incredibly fertile Nile Delta and the plains of North Africa, it gained access to what were essentially the breadbaskets of the ancient world. These provinces could produce grain on a scale that Italy simply couldn't match, and at a far lower cost. The Roman state, recognizing a strategic opportunity, began to systematically tax these provinces in kind, demanding shiploads of grain as tribute. This grain was then shipped to Ostia, the port of Rome, and distributed at a subsidized price, or even for free, to the city's citizens. The political motive was clear. A well-fed populace in the capital was a peaceful one. But the unintended and perhaps even calculated economic consequence was a seismic shift in Italian agriculture. Why would a landowner in Latium or Campania waste his valuable, well-watered soil growing low-margin wheat, when the market was being flooded with cheaper, state-sponsored grain from abroad? The answer was he wouldn't. He would pivot to a cash crop, something that could turn a much higher profit on the same piece of land. And the most obvious, prestigious, and profitable choice was the vine. This shift from subsistence farming to commercial viticulture was turbocharged by the writings of agricultural experts like Cato and, later, Columella. They didn't just provide farming tips. They preached a gospel of profit. Cotto famously ran the numbers, providing a clear-eyed economic comparison of different types of farms. He concluded that a well-managed vineyard was, by a huge margin, the most lucrative use of a farmer's land and capital. He wasn't talking about a small family plot, but a large, slave-staffed enterprise designed for export. This profit-driven mindset, combined with the safety net of the annona, created a gold rush mentality among the Roman elite. Wealthy senators and equestrians began buying up vast tracts of land, consolidating small farms into sprawling latifundia dedicated almost exclusively to wine production. The Italian landscape was physically transformed, with rolling hills once dotted with wheat fields now covered in neat, orderly rows of vines as far as the eye could see. This wasn't just an increase in production. It was the birth of a true wine industry, an agricultural sector focused entirely on producing a surplus for a massive, empire-wide market. The cheap grain from Africa and Egypt didn't just feed the people of Rome. It effectively fertilized the vineyards of Italy, creating the economic conditions that allowed wine to be produced in such overwhelming quantities that its price plummeted, making it accessible to all. This system of specialization didn't stop at the Italian coast. The same economic forces that turned Italy into a wine factory also shaped the empire's periphery. As Italian wine flooded the markets in new provinces like Gaul and Spain, it created a taste for Roman culture and Roman products. But soon, a fascinating reversal occurred. These provinces, initially consumers, began to adopt Roman agricultural techniques and started producing their own wine. The regions of Gallia Narbonensis and Hispania Tarraconensis, with their own favorable climates and soils, began to compete directly with Italian producers. They could often produce wine at an even lower cost, thanks to their proximity to new markets and potentially lower labor costs. This created a truly integrated imperial economy. Grain from Egypt fed the people of Rome, wine from Italy supplied the legions on the Rhine, and eventually, wine from Gaul supplied the cities of Britain. This complex web of trade, all moving along the protected sea lanes and famous Roman roads, meant that no single region had to be self-sufficient. A province could focus on what it did best, whether that was growing grain, producing wine, mining metals, or making pottery. This division of labor and specialization, enforced by the Pax Romana and the efficiency of Roman logistics, drove down the cost of all goods, including wine. The affordability of a legionary's daily ration was not an accident. It was the direct result of a sophisticated, continent-spanning economic system that optimized production across the entire known world, turning the Mediterranean Sea into a giant conveyor belt for the staples of life. Now we come to the unspoken engine that made this entire system possible, the brutal human machinery that powered the Roman vineyard. The staggering affordability of wine, the sheer volume that flooded the empire, was built on a foundation that was not just economic, but profoundly human and inhuman. The vast latifundia, the sprawling agricultural estates that dominated the Italian countryside, were not picturesque family farms. They were factories in the field, and their primary fuel was an endless supply of unfree labor. To understand how a landowner could sell wine so cheaply and still grow fabulously wealthy, you have to look past the vines and into the eyes of the slaves who tended them. The economics are chillingly simple. A free laborer expects a wage, a share of the profit from his work. A slave in the Roman system required only the barest subsistence to keep functioning, a daily ration of poor quality bread, a measure of the cheapest wine or lora, a few vegetables, and a spot on the floor of a crowded, barracks-like building called an ergastulum. There were no payrolls, no benefits, no pensions. The initial purchase price of a healthy slave was the single largest investment, and after that, the cost of maintaining that human being for a lifetime of labor was minuscule. This created a profit margin on agricultural goods that free labor could never, ever compete with. A landowner using slaves could sell his wine at a price so low it would bankrupt a farmer relying on paid workers, and yet the landowner would still amass a fortune. This wasn't a side effect of the system. It was the entire point. The management of this workforce was coldly systematic, designed to extract the maximum possible labor for the minimum possible cost. Our guide here is, once again, Cato the Elder, whose writings are less a farming manual and more a treatise on human resource management in a slave-based economy. He provides meticulous, dehumanizing calculations. For a vineyard of 125 acres, he specifies the exact workforce needed: a villicus or foreman, his wife, 10 laborers, a farmhand, a donkey driver, a swineherd, and a shepherd, 16 people in total to manage a massive, profit-generating operation. Cato then goes on to detail their rations with a miser's precision. He dictates how much bread, salt, oil, and wine each slave is to receive, always the lowest quality available. He even instructs the foreman to make the slaves tunics from old, worn-out sacks, and to demand the return of these tunics when they become too tattered to be patched again. The slaves were treated as living tools, assets to be maintained just well enough to prevent breakdown, but no better. The villicus himself was often a slave, chosen for his obedience and ruthlessness. His job was to drive the work gangs from before sunrise until after sunset, every day of the year. During the harvest, the pace became frantic. Slaves would work in long chains, moving down the rows of vines, their backs bent, their hands moving swiftly to strip the grapes into large baskets. There was no care for the fruit, no gentle handling to preserve delicate flavors. The goal was speed and volume. Any sign of slacking, any perceived laziness, was met with swift and severe punishment. The threat of the whip was constant, and for more serious offenses, the punishment could be branding, being sold to the dreaded mines, or crucifixion. The Roman writer Columella, while slightly more humane than Cato, still advised that a good foreman must exact work relentlessly, and that the master should periodically inspect the slaves' quarters to ensure the chains and fetters were heavy enough to prevent escape. This atmosphere of relentless pressure and constant supervision was designed to crush any resistance and maximize the output from every single worker. The human cost of this system was immeasurable. Life for an agricultural slave was one of unending toil, poor nutrition, and psychological terror. They were separated from their families, their cultures, and their homelands. They had no legal rights, no recourse against abuse, and no hope for the future beyond an old age of being sold off or simply discarded if they became too infirm to work. The very landscape was shaped by their suffering. The ergastula where they slept were often partially underground, with small, high windows, more like prisons than dormitories. Some were even built with stocks inside, so that troublesome slaves could be chained up at night. This brutal reality is the dark shadow behind every cup of cheap Roman wine. The social stability that wine provided for the Roman citizen, the comfort it brought to the soldier, was purchased with the misery of countless anonymous men, women, and children who lived and died in the vineyards. The economic miracle of affordable wine for the masses was, in truth, a paradox built on a foundation of profound human exploitation. a reminder that the glory of Rome was sustained by an engine of suffering that operated silently and ruthlessly just beyond the city walls. Yet, even with a system built on slave labor and specialized agriculture, the Roman state still needed a way to pay for the very infrastructure that made this all possible: the roads, the ports, and the fleets that protected the sea lanes. This is where the complex and often contradictory world of Roman taxation enters our story, creating a fascinating push and pull on the price of wine that reveals just how strategically the empire viewed this humble beverage. On one hand, wine was a prime target for revenue, a commodity so ubiquitous that taxing it was like turning on a financial tap. On the other hand, the state understood that making wine too expensive for the masses in the city of Rome was a recipe for riots and instability. The result was a delicate balancing act, where taxation policies could simultaneously inflate the price of wine in the provinces while actively working to suppress it in the capital. The primary mechanism for generating revenue from wine was a complex web of customs duties known as portoria. These were not simple sales taxes applied at the point of purchase, but rather tolls levied on goods as they moved across the empire's internal boundaries. Think of the Roman Empire not as a single, seamless market, but as a collection of distinct customs zones. A merchant shipping amphorae of wine from a vineyard in Campania to a market in Gaul would have to pay a percentage of the cargo's declared value as it left Italy, and then likely pay another duty when it entered the Gallic province. These tariffs were collected at designated ports, major road junctions, and river crossings by teams of private tax farmers known as publicani, who bid for the right to collect the taxes and then pocketed any amount they gathered over the state's required minimum. This system naturally added layers of cost to the final price of the wine. Every time an amphora was taxed, that cost was passed down the line, eventually landing on the consumer. A legionary in Germania or a shopkeeper in Hispania would be paying a price that included these cumulative transit taxes. For wine shipped over long distances, these duties could be significant, making imported wine a more luxurious item in frontier provinces and ensuring that locally produced wines always had a competitive advantage. But the story of taxation and wine takes a dramatic and revealing turn when we focus on the city of Rome itself. Here, the imperial government's priorities shifted decisively from revenue generation to social control. The million-plus inhabitants of the capital were a volatile political force, and their contentment was non-negotiable. Just as the state provided subsidized grain through the annona to prevent bread riots, it also took active steps to ensure a steady and affordable supply of wine for the urban plebeians. This was not a matter of generosity, it was a calculated investment in public order. Emperors from Augustus onward understood that a populace that was well-fed and adequately supplied with wine was far less likely to revolt. Consequently, the city of Rome itself was often treated as a special economic zone, largely exempt from the internal tariffs that drove up prices elsewhere. Wine shipped to the capital for public consumption was frequently given tax-free status or was transported on state-owned ships, effectively cutting out the middlemen and the publicani to keep costs at a minimum. This policy of ensuring cheap wine for the masses reached its most explicit form under Emperor Aurelian in the late 3rd century AD. Facing economic crisis and political uncertainty, Aurelian made a monumental decision. He added wine to the official annona. This wasn't just a temporary measure. It was the formal state recognition of wine as a public utility, as essential as bread. The imperial administration began directly distributing wine to the citizens of Rome, often for free or at a heavily subsidized price. This wine was not the fine Falernian of the aristocracy. It was the sharp, common vinum ordinarium that was the lifeblood of the taverns. To manage this, the state took control of vast wine-producing estates in Italy and beyond, creating a vertically integrated supply chain that ran from the vineyard to the public distribution point in the city. The message was unmistakable. The emperor himself was now your patron, your provider of both bread and wine. This direct provision served as a powerful tool of propaganda, binding the loyalty of the urban populace to the emperor personally, while simultaneously neutering the power of the Senate and other elites who had previously used private benefactions to curry political favor. In the end, the Roman tax system as it related to wine tells a dual tale. It was a tool for extracting wealth from the prosperous provinces, but when it came to the heart of the empire, it was willingly set aside in favor of a far more valuable currency, social stability, and political survival. Now, with the harvest processed and the wine pressed, we need to consider the vessels that made this entire system possible. To truly grasp the economics of Roman wine, we must look at the tools of the trade not as unique artifacts, but as mass-produced commodities in their own right. The sheer scale of Roman viticulture required an equally vast industrial ecosystem dedicated to manufacturing the essential equipment: the presses, the fermentation jars, and the shipping containers. This wasn't a cottage industry of local craftsmen. It was a world of specialized workshops, standardized designs, and assembly line production that drove down the cost of every piece of equipment, making it affordable for a vineyard owner to outfit a massive estate, and in turn, keep the price of his wine low enough to compete in a crowded marketplace. Consider the heart of the operation, the wine press or torcularium. In its most common form, this was a formidable machine built from wood, a lever press that applied immense force to the grape pomace. A large, heavy wooden beam, often made from a single, massive tree trunk, was anchored at one end. The other end was pulled down by a team of workers using a windlass or a screw mechanism, squeezing the pulp in a basket or between boards. The genius of its affordability lay in its design and its mode of production. These were not custom-built for each farm. Instead, specialized carpentry workshops, located in towns with easy access to timber supplies, produced them in standard sizes. They would prefabricate the components of the beams, the base frames, the screw mechanisms if they were used, allowing for quick assembly on site. This modular approach meant a landowner didn't need to hire a team of master carpenters for months. He could simply order a press from a catalog of sorts and have it delivered and set up with relative speed and at a predictable cost. The widespread availability of these efficient, standardized presses meant that even a moderately prosperous farmer could invest in technology that dramatically increased his yield, a key step in the overall democratization of wine production. Once the juice was pressed, it had to ferment, and for this, the Romans relied on one of the most iconic and essential vessels of their world, the dolium. These were not small jugs or barrels, but colossal terracotta jars, often taller than a person and capable of holding hundreds of gallons of liquid. They were the static fermentation tanks and storage vats of the Roman winery, permanently set into the ground of a dedicated storage room, the cella venaria. The production of these giants was a feat of industrial pottery. Specialized workshops, often located near sources of high-quality clay and abundant fuel for their massive kilns, focused exclusively on creating these monsters. The potters used a coiling technique, building the jar up layer by layer with thick ropes of clay, a process that required immense skill and strength. Firing something so large and thick without it cracking was a monumental challenge, and the successful firing of a dozen or more dolia at once represented a huge capital investment for the workshop owner. This specialization is what drove costs down. A workshop that made nothing but dolia could perfect its technique, optimize its clay recipes and kiln temperatures, and achieve economies of scale that a general-purpose potter could never match. For the vineyard owner, buying a set of these jars was a major one-time investment, but because they were built to last for generations, the cost per vintage, spread over decades, became negligible. This durability and the low long-term cost of storage were absolutely critical for producing wine cheaply and in consistent quality year after year. And finally, we return to the humble amphora, the ultimate symbol of Roman trade. We've already discussed its brilliant design for shipping, but its affordability was born in workshops that operated with the efficiency of factories. In major port cities and pottery districts like the Janiculum in Rome or around Arezzo, amphora production was a high-volume business. Potters used a combination of techniques for speed and consistency. While the neck and rim were thrown on a fast wheel, the body was often shaped using a reusable mold, a technique that allowed less skilled apprentices to produce the main body of the vessel with perfect uniformity. Handles were pressed in molds and then slapped onto the body with a practiced, rapid motion. A single workshop, with a master potter overseeing a team of workers, could produce hundreds of these vessels in a single day. The kilns themselves were colossal structures, capable of firing thousands of amphorae in a single batch. This scale of production drove the individual cost of each amphora down to a minuscule amount. So cheap were they to produce that, as we saw with Monte Testaccio, it was often more economical to use them once and discard them at the point of consumption than to ship the heavy, empty vessels all the way back to their origin. This disposability, a concept we associate with modern packaging, was a key factor in the entire economic model. When the cost of the container is a trivial fraction of the value of the product it carries, you can afford to ship that product across the known world and still sell it at a price that almost anyone can afford. The mass production of the amphora was the final, crucial link in a chain of industrial processes that began with the standardized wine press and the giant fermentation jar, a chain that bound together the entire Roman wine economy and ensured that the cup of the common citizen would always be full. This sprawling, industrial-scale production of wine created a marketplace of almost unimaginable diversity and, inevitably, deception. While we might imagine ancient Romans simply buying wine, they were actually navigating a complex hierarchy of quality and origin, a system where the name on the amphora, or rather, the inscription stamped into its handle, could make all the difference between a luxury experience and a cheap headache. The Romans absolutely had a concept of wine regions, what we might think of as a crude precursor to the modern French appellation d'origine contrôlée. Writers like Pliny the Elder and Galen wrote extensively about the unique characteristics of wines from specific hillsides and valleys, creating a canon of celebrated vintages that any wealthy Roman would recognize. At the very pinnacle of this hierarchy sat wines like Falernian, grown on the slopes of Mount Falernus in Campania. This was the Roman equivalent of a premier Cru Bordeaux or a Grand Cru Burgundy. Falernian was famous for its high alcohol content, its golden color, and its remarkable ability to age for decades, sometimes even a century. It was a wine of such prestige that it was typically only drunk by the imperial family, senior senators, and the most successful merchants, and its price was astronomically high. Other regions, like Caecuban from Latium or Mamertine from Sicily, also commanded premium prices and were name-dropped by poets as symbols of extreme wealth and refined taste. But for the vast majority of Romans, the average consumer buying his daily measure from a local taberna or a street vendor, the idea of drinking a pure, unadulterated Falernian was a fantasy. The origin of the cheap, mass-market wine they drank was often deliberately vague or creatively misrepresented. This is where the Roman wine market reveals its cunning and often fraudulent underbelly. Unscrupulous merchants, operating in the bustling ports and warehouses where wine was bought and sold in bulk, engaged in practices that would be familiar to any modern regulator fighting food fraud. The most common trick was blending. A merchant might take a single amphora of genuine, expensive Falernian and mix it with 10 or 20 amphorae of a much cheaper, generic wine from, say, the high-yield vineyards of southern Spain. This diluted concoction could then be sold as Falernian, or more slyly, as wine in the Falernian style, at a price that was still well above its true value, but far below that of the pure product. The average drinker, who had likely never tasted real Falernian, would be none the wiser, believing they were getting a taste of the high life. This practice was so widespread that writers like Horace and Martial often made jokes about tavern keepers who claimed to sell famous wines, but whose offerings tasted suspiciously like common vinegar. An even bolder form of deception was outright counterfeiting. Here, a merchant would take a cheap, locally produced wine, perhaps a rough, astringent vintage from the Roman suburbs, and simply label the amphorae as coming from a prestigious region. This was easier than it might seem. While some regions had distinctive clay or amphora shapes that were hard to fake, many did not. A merchant in Rome could acquire a shipment of cheap wine from North Africa, repot it into amphorae that were stamped with a fake Falernum mark, and sell it at a massive profit to a distributor who either was in on the scam or was himself duped. There was no central regulatory body to verify these claims. It was a marketplace operating largely on the honor system, and honor was often the first casualty in the pursuit of profit. The Roman satirist Petronius, in his work The Satyricon, perfectly captures this culture of pretension and fraud at the famously extravagant dinner of the absurdly wealthy freedman Trimalchio. Trimalchio serves a wine he pompously claims is 100 years old, a Falernian of legendary vintage, but the narrator notes that it tastes remarkably ordinary, leading the reader to understand it is almost certainly a fake, a prop in Trimalchio's desperate performance of sophistication. For the merchants, this systematic misrepresentation was not just about making a quick denarius. It was a brilliant way to move massive quantities of cheaper, lower-quality stock that might otherwise be difficult to sell. By attaching the name of a famous region to a mediocre wine, they could instantly increase its perceived value and clear their warehouses of surplus. This created a peculiar trickle-down effect in the Roman wine economy. The very existence of a luxury brand like Falernian created a market for counterfeits and blends that, in turn, helped to absorb the enormous output of the empire's industrial-scale vineyards. The demand for Falernian, even if it was 95% fraudulent, helped ensure that the vineyards producing the cheap base wine still found a buyer. In this way, the prestige of the few supported the economy of the many, all hinging on a shared willingness to believe the label on the jar. This system of vague origins and creative labeling meant that the Roman experience of wine was often one of imagined geographies and aspirational tasting. A world where what you thought you were drinking was frequently far more important than what was actually in your cup. With all this wine now being produced across the empire, a monumental logistical challenge emerged: how to move this literal sea of liquid from the sun-drenched vineyards to the thirsty mouths thousands of miles away. The Roman solution was a triumph of engineering and organization. A distribution network so efficient that it turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake, and its roads into the arteries of commerce. The sheer volume of wine in motion was staggering. Amphorae filled with wine were not just occasional cargo. They were the bulk goods that filled the holds of merchant ships and the carts of traders, a constant flowing river of sustenance that bound the provinces to the capital. This was not a haphazard process of individual merchants making risky journeys. It was a highly organized system, and its efficiency was the final, critical factor that crushed the per-unit cost of wine, ensuring that a tavern in distant Londinium could sell a cup for a price a soldier could afford. The most vital of these routes were the sea lanes. While the famous Roman roads capture our imagination, it was the ships that truly powered the empire's economy. Transporting heavy, bulky goods like wine overland was prohibitively expensive. A wagon pulled by oxen could only carry a limited number of amphorae, and the animals themselves required feed and rest, making the journey slow and the final cost of the wine exorbitant. The sea, however, was a different story. A single, medium-sized merchant ship, known as a corbetta for its tub-like hull, could carry a cargo that would require a line of hundreds of wagons. The wreck of the Madrague de Jeans, which we mentioned earlier, held between 6,000 and 7,000 amphorae. Just one of those amphorae held about 25 liters of wine. That means a single ship was transporting the equivalent of over 150,000 liters of wine, enough to fill a modern Olympic-sized swimming pool to a depth of several feet. And this was just one vessel among thousands that plied the Mediterranean in a constant shuttle between producer and consumer. The cost savings were astronomical. By moving wine in such colossal batches, the cost of transport for each individual amphora became almost negligible, a tiny fraction of the price it would have been by land. These ships were not general-purpose vessels. They were specialized tools designed for one job, carrying amphorae. Their hulls were uniquely shaped, with a rounded, capacious belly perfectly contoured to hold the pointed bases of the jars. The crew would stack the amphorae in layers, carefully nesting the pointed end of one between the rounded shoulders of two in the layer below, creating a stable, interlocked cargo that could withstand the rolling and pitching of a sea voyage. The narrow necks were sealed with cork or a clay stopper covered in pitch, and the entire shipment would be covered with sails or mats to protect it from the sun and spray. These ships, guided by experienced captains who understood the seasonal winds and currents, followed well-established routes. A typical journey might see a ship loaded with Spanish wine sail from Tarraco to the great transshipment port of Ostia, the harbor of Rome. There, the amphorae would be unloaded by teams of dockworkers, sorted in vast warehouses, and then either distributed within the city or loaded onto smaller riverboats to be sent up the Tiber, or onto other seagoing vessels bound for provinces like Gaul or North Africa. This maritime network was protected by the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The Roman navy actively patrolled the sea lanes, suppressing piracy and ensuring that merchant ships could travel from one end of the empire to the other without the constant fear of attack. This security was a massive hidden subsidy for the wine trade. A merchant did not need to invest in heavy armaments for his ship or pay for a military escort. He could operate on thin margins because the Roman state had already assumed the cost of making the seas safe. Furthermore, the Romans constructed and maintained lighthouses, like the famous one at Dover in Britannia, or the even more colossal pharos at Alexandria, to guide ships into port safely, day and night. This state-backed infrastructure, the safe sea lanes, the lighthouses, the deep water ports, was just as important as the ships themselves in creating a low-cost, reliable distribution system. And while the sea did the heavy lifting, the famous Roman roads played a crucial secondary role, acting as the capillaries that delivered the wine to the empire's inland frontiers. Once a shipment of wine arrived at a major port like Massilia in southern Gaul or Gades in Spain, it was broken down into smaller lots. Traders would load amphorae onto sturdy carts or pack trains of mules to begin the journey north and west. The wine destined for the legions stationed along the Rhine or in Britannia would travel along impeccably engineered roads like the Via Domitia in Gaul, stone-paved highways that were usable in all weather. While this overland leg was more expensive, its cost was minimized by the efficiency of the roads themselves. A cart could travel much faster on a smooth, graded Roman road than on a muddy track, and the network of state-run posting stations, the mansions, provided secure places for drivers and animals to rest. This integrated system, the high-volume, low-cost sea transport combined with the reliable, all-weather road network, meant that a vineyard owner in Baetica could reasonably expect his wine to be purchased and consumed by a centurion guarding Hadrian's Wall a few months later. The entire empire functioned as a single, sprawling market, and the humble amphora of wine, riding the waves and rolling along the stone-paved roads, was both a symbol and a direct beneficiary of this unprecedented logistical achievement. This fundamental shift in the Roman diet meant that wine's role was far more than social or recreational. It was woven into the very biology of daily life. For the vast majority of the population, the soldiers, the laborers, the urban poor, every meal was built around two pillars, bread and wine. While bread provided the bulk of the carbohydrates, wine delivered a crucial supplemental stream of calories. We must remember that this was not the high-alcohol, intensely flavorful wine we might sip today. The everyday vinum ordinarium was often a thin, acidic beverage, but it still contained alcohol and residual sugars from the grape must, providing a readily available energy source. A soldier on the march, burning thousands of calories a day, wasn't just drinking for pleasure. He was consuming a functional, calorie-dense liquid that helped fuel his body alongside his rations of wheat or barley. A dockworker hauling heavy amphorae in the Austrian sun relied on that daily wine ration not merely for a moment of respite, but as a tangible input of energy that could mean the difference between finishing his shift and collapsing from exhaustion. In a world where food insecurity was a constant threat for the non-elite, wine was a reliable, state-supplied calorie stream that complemented the grain dole, forming a complete nutritional safety net that kept the workforce on its feet and the empire functioning. Perhaps even more critical than its caloric contribution was wine's role as the primary vehicle for safe hydration. The sprawling, million-strong city of Rome was an engineering marvel, but it was also a public health nightmare. While aqueducts brought fresh water into the city, the distribution network within the dense, overcrowded insulae apartments was precarious at best. Water stored in cisterns or drawn from public fountains could easily be contaminated with bacteria from human waste, a constant hazard in a city with a primitive sewer system. For the common Roman, drinking plain water was a genuine gamble. a risk of dysentery, typhoid, or other waterborne diseases that could disable or kill. Wine, particularly when mixed with water to create the standard drinking beverage, offered a powerful, if rudimentary, solution. The alcohol content, though diluted, and the wine's natural acidity created an environment that was hostile to many of the pathogens lurking in the water supply. While they had no scientific understanding of germs, the Romans observed through centuries of experience that people who drank diluted wine tended to get sick less often than those who drank plain water. This practical wisdom became encoded in their culture. The Greek physician Hippocrates had already noted the antiseptic properties of wine for cleaning wounds, and the Romans applied this same logic internally to their drinking water. The act of mixing wine and water in the crater wasn't just a social ritual. It was a daily, household-level public health intervention. This dual identity as both food and safe drink fundamentally altered the economic calculus for every level of Roman society, from the individual consumer to the imperial administration. For a poor family living in a cramped apartment, purchasing a measure of cheap wine was not an optional luxury. It was a necessary expense, as vital as buying bread or a little olive oil. It was a two-for-one deal. You were acquiring both hydration and calories in a single, relatively stable product. This dramatically increased its perceived value and, consequently, the justification for its mass production. A farmer deciding what to plant knew there would always be a market for wine grapes, not because everyone wanted to get drunk, but because everyone needed to drink safely. The Roman state, in its relentless pragmatism, understood this perfectly. By ensuring a stable, affordable supply of wine through the tax policies and the annona system we discussed, the government was effectively subsidizing public health and maintaining labor productivity. They weren't just preventing riots by providing bread and circuses. They were preventing the collapse of the urban workforce from disease by ensuring the populace had access to a sanitized beverage. The value of wine was therefore immeasurable. It was a form of edible infrastructure, as critical to the empire's longevity as its roads and aqueducts, because it quite literally kept the human machinery of the state alive, hydrated, and functioning day after day. Within the heart of every Roman vineyard's pressing facility stood the true workhorse of the entire operation, the dolium. These were not mere storage jars. They were colossal, unglazed terracotta vats, often taller than a full-grown adult, and capacious enough to hold hundreds of gallons of fermenting grape must. Imagine a room, a cella veneria, with the floor looking like a field of gigantic, buried flower pots, their wide mouths open to the air, filled to the brim with the bubbling, frothing juice of the recent harvest. This method of fermentation, which might seem primitive at first glance, was in fact a masterpiece of low-tech biochemical engineering, a solution that leveraged the very properties of earth and clay to create a stable environment for turning sugar into alcohol without the need for expensive, energy-intensive temperature control. The genius began with the material itself. Unlike the sealed, sterile stainless steel tanks of a modern winery, a Roman dolium was porous. Its unglazed clay walls were not a flaw but a feature, acting as a semi-permeable membrane for the wine inside. As the yeast, naturally present on the grape skins, began its frantic feast on the sugars in the must, it produced two primary byproducts, alcohol and carbon dioxide. This process generates a tremendous amount of heat, and if that heat is not managed, it can kill the very yeast responsible for the fermentation, stalling the process and spoiling the entire batch. The porous walls of the dolium provided a passive, yet remarkably effective, cooling system. A small amount of the liquid would slowly weep through the microscopic pores in the clay, and as this moisture evaporated from the exterior surface of the jar, it drew heat away from the wine inside, much like human sweat cools the body. This gentle, continuous evaporation acted as a natural thermostat, preventing the fermenting must from reaching temperatures that would be lethal to the yeast, all without any moving parts or human intervention. This evaporation through the porous clay also served a second, equally vital function: micro-oxygenation. While a completely airtight seal would be disastrous for fermentation, a tiny, controlled exchange of gases was beneficial. The minute amount of oxygen that could permeate the clay walls helped to keep the yeast healthy and active throughout the process. Later, after the violent primary fermentation was complete, this same gentle breathing allowed for a slow, subtle maturation of the wine, softening some of its rougher, youthful edges. Of course, this permeability meant there was also a small, constant loss of volume. The Romans accepted this minor sacrifice as a simple cost of doing business, a negligible price to pay for the massive benefit of a stable, self-regulating fermentation vessel. The second part of this ingenious system was the practice of burying the dolia up to their necks in the earth. This was not merely for stability, it was a form of prehistoric geothermal climate control. The soil acts as a tremendous thermal mass, buffering the contents of the jar against the daily and seasonal swings in air temperature. During the heat of the Italian afternoon, when the sun beat down on the tile roof of the cella veneria, the earth surrounding the dolia remained significantly cooler, drawing excess heat away from the fermenting wine. Conversely, during a cool autumn night, the residual warmth held in the soil would prevent the temperature inside the jar from dropping too sharply, which could also put the yeast to sleep and halt fermentation. This stable, cool underground environment was the Roman equivalent of a modern temperature-controlled cellar, but it required no construction beyond digging a hole. It was a zero-energy solution that provided a consistent, ideal environment for the slow, steady completion of fermentation, ensuring a more reliable and predictable result from vintage to vintage. When you combine these two factors, the evaporative cooling of the porous clay and the geothermal stability of the buried jar, you have a fermentation system that was astonishingly effective, remarkably cheap, and scalable to an industrial level. A vineyard owner did not need to invest in building expensive, stone-lined subterranean cellars, nor did he need to worry about the labor of constantly monitoring and adjusting temperatures. Once the dolia were set in the ground, they were a permanent fixture of the farm, a capital investment that would last for generations. The only real maintenance required was a thorough cleaning between vintages. This low overhead approach was absolutely fundamental to the economics of cheap Roman wine. It allowed a producer to ferment enormous volumes of wine simultaneously with minimal risk of spoilage, and almost no ongoing operational cost beyond the initial outlay for the jars and the labor to bury them. This simple, elegant combination of earth and clay was a technological triumph that turned the volatile, unpredictable process of fermentation into a routine, manageable, and highly profitable operation, forming the quiet, stable heart of the entire Roman wine industry. Beyond the bustling taverns and legionary forts, the story of cheap Roman wine ascended to a higher plane, finding a sacred purpose in the rituals that connected everyday citizens to their gods and their ancestors. For the Romans, religion was not a weekly event confined to a temple. It was a continuous, intimate dialogue with the divine, woven into the fabric of domestic life. In the quiet privacy of their homes, within the lararium, the small household shrine that held statues of the family's guardian spirits, the lairs, the Romans performed daily acts of devotion. And at the heart of these rituals, as essential as the prayer itself, was a small offering of wine. This was the libation, a practice so common it was as routine as lighting a candle or saying grace. The head of the household would pour a small amount of wine from a simple jug onto the altar or directly onto the hearth fire, where the sizzle and steam were seen as a physical offering, a fragrant vapor pleasing to the gods. But this was not the precious, aged Falernian reserved for feasts. For these daily offerings, the wine was invariably the same sharp, affordable vinum ordinarium that the family drank with their meals. Using the cheap, mass-produced wine for these rituals was a profound statement of practicality and piety. It demonstrated that the gods were not remote, demanding entities requiring extravagant gifts, but were present in the household's daily sustenance. The gods received a share of the very same wine that nourished and hydrated the family, binding the divine and the mundane in a shared, daily experience. This created a staggering, empire-wide demand for affordable wine that went far beyond mere nutrition. Every single observant household across the vast expanse of the empire, from the humblest peasant hut to the more prosperous townhouse, was a tiny, persistent consumer in a sacred market, their small daily libations adding up to a river of wine flowing not into human stomachs, but onto a million altars. This sacred connection extended beyond the home and into the realm of public festivals, where the scale of consumption could become truly monumental. Throughout the Roman year, a relentless calendar of religious festivals honored a vast pantheon of gods. During these public ceremonies, the state or wealthy benefactors would often provide sacrifices and offerings on a colossal scale. At a festival for Jupiter, the king of the gods, or for Bacchus, the god of wine himself, priests might pour libations not from a small household cup, but from large ceremonial vessels, dousing altars with gallons of wine. The animals sacrificed to the gods were often sanctified with a ritual drenching of wine before their slaughter. After the public ceremony, the meat from these sacrifices was frequently distributed to the populace, and this communal feast was invariably accompanied by generous distributions of the same cheap wine used in the ritual. In this way, a religious act seamlessly transitioned into a form of social welfare and political patronage, with the state or a politician using sanctified wine to reinforce community bonds and curry favor with the citizenry. The demand here was not incremental, it was tidal. Preparing for a major festival required sourcing hundreds or even thousands of amphorae of acceptable, affordable wine, creating massive, predictable spikes in demand that the industrial-scale vineyards were perfectly positioned to supply. The entire religious calendar, therefore, acted as a powerful economic engine, ensuring a stable and cyclical market for producers and guaranteeing that the pipelines of distribution remained full and flowing. Perhaps the most poignant and universal ritual use of wine, however, was in the cult of the dead. For the Romans, the memory of one's ancestors, the manes, was a sacred duty. The bond of family was not severed by death, it was merely transformed. To maintain this connection and ensure the peace of the departed, families were expected to regularly visit the graves of their ancestors, especially during festivals like the Parentalia. At these tombs, often located in necropolises just outside the city walls, they would perform simple but essential rites. They would bring offerings of food, bread, salt, and beans, and they would pour libations of wine directly onto the grave itself. The belief was that the spirits of the dead could partake of the essence of these offerings, and a libation of wine was a particularly powerful way to show ongoing reverence and to placate the spirits. ensuring they remained benevolent guardians of the family rather than restless, malevolent ghosts. The wine used in these funerary rites was, again, the common wine of the people. It was a deeply democratic practice. Whether you were a senator visiting the elaborate family mausoleum or a freedwoman standing at the simple marker of her child, you performed the same act with the same fundamental substance. This universal cultural mandate meant that the demand for cheap wine was utterly inelastic. Even in times of personal hardship or economic downturn, a family would still feel the profound religious and social obligation to provide for their ancestors, securing a small but constant market for the cheapest grades of wine, the very Laura or thin Posca that might otherwise have struggled to find a buyer. The dead, in their silent, insistent way, became some of the empire's most reliable consumers. This deep integration of wine into the spiritual life of the empire had a powerful feedback effect on its production. The constant, ritual-driven demand for affordable wine provided a stable economic floor for the entire industry. A vineyard owner knew that even if a particular vintage was too harsh or acidic to be a popular drinking wine, there would always be a market for it in the religious and funerary sectors, where its symbolic value far outweighed its taste. This incentivized the mass production of even the most basic grades of wine, as producers understood that virtually their entire output, from the decent second press wine to the watery dregs of the final pressing, could find a buyer somewhere in the complex tapestry of Roman ritual life. The gods and the dead, therefore, were not passive recipients of human surplus. They were active participants in the Roman economy. Their perceived needs created a perpetual low-end market that absorbed the vast output of the industrial vineyards, allowing producers to operate at a scale that would have been impossible if they were only supplying the drinking population. In the end, the Roman genius for affordability was not just a triumph of agriculture and logistics, but also a function of their profound and all-encompassing piety, a civilization that poured its faith, quite literally, from the same cheap clay cup that quenched its daily thirst. Yet this relentless drive for production did not stop at the Italian coastline. The story of cheap Roman wine is not simply one of Italy feeding the empire, but of the empire itself being transformed into one vast, interconnected vineyard. As the legions marched, they didn't just bring military rule, they brought a taste for home, a cultural package that included the vine. The Romans actively exported their entire viticultural system to their provinces, most notably to Gaul, which is modern-day France, and to the sun-drenched landscapes of Hispania. This was a deliberate act of agricultural colonization. Where they established a new town or a veteran colony, they would identify suitable land, well-drained slopes, sunny aspects, and they would plant cuttings brought from Italy or would instruct local populations in Roman methods. They weren't just shipping finished amphorae. They were transplanting the entire industry, creating new, decentralized production centers that would ultimately reshape the empire's economy. These provincial vineyards were established with the same ruthless focus on volume and efficiency that defined the Italian latifundia. Using slave labor and standardized techniques, regions like Gallia Narbonensis in southern France and the Ebro Valley in Spain were soon covered in orderly rows of vines. The climate and soils of these areas were often exceptional for grape growing, sometimes even superior to those in parts of Italy. Within a few generations, these provinces were not just supplying their own local needs. They were producing a massive surplus, turning from consumers of Italian wine into fierce competitors in the broader imperial market. This explosion of provincial production had a dramatic effect on the Italian heartland. For centuries, Italian wine, particularly from regions like Campania and Latium, had enjoyed a near monopoly on quality and a dominant position in trade. The poets sang its praises, and the elites paid premium prices. But by the 1st century AD, a seismic shift was underway. Writers like Pliny the Elder began to note, sometimes with a hint of patriotic concern, that the wines from Gaul and Spain were gaining a formidable reputation. They were cheaper to produce, and because they were grown closer to the new consumer markets on the northern frontiers, they were cheaper to transport. An amphora of wine from Tarraconensis in Spain could be shipped directly to a legionary fortress in Britannia at a fraction of the cost of an Italian amphora that had to travel the entire length of the Mediterranean and then up the Atlantic coast. This simple fact of geography and logistics gave provincial wines an undeniable economic advantage. Archaeological evidence vividly tells this story of market conquest. In the layers of Roman-era trash dumps in places like London and Cologne, archaeologists initially find a high proportion of amphorae from Italy. But as time goes on, those Italian jars become rarer, steadily replaced by the distinctive, often smaller, amphorae from Gaul and Spain. The provinces had learned the Roman lesson all too well. Produce in overwhelming volume, standardize your methods, and you can outcompete anyone, even the masters who taught you the craft. For the average consumer across the empire, this fierce competition between Italian and provincial producers was an incredible boon. The influx of millions of additional amphorae from Gaul and Spain into the trading networks created a glut of supply. Basic economics took over. When supply radically outpaces demand, prices fall and stay low. A soldier on the Danube frontier or a shopkeeper in a North African town now had a choice. He could buy the slightly more prestigious but more expensive Italian wine, or he could opt for the perfectly serviceable and significantly cheaper local Gallic or Spanish vintage. For most people, the decision was simple. The consistent availability of these affordable provincial wines meant that the daily ration of vinum ordinarium became even more secure and its price even more stable, insulating the populace from the kind of shortages and price spikes that could lead to unrest. This created a virtuous cycle for the empire. Cheap wine kept the people and the army content, which in turn secured the Pax Romana, which then allowed the safe and efficient trade that made the wine cheap in the first place. The Roman Empire had effectively created a self-reinforcing economic loop, and the provincial vineyards were the engine that powered it. This decentralization of production also made the entire system more resilient. No longer was the empire's wine supply dependent on the success of the Italian harvest. A drought in Campania or a volcanic event that damaged vineyards in Latium might have caused a crisis in an earlier era. But with major production hubs now established in Gaul, Spain, North Africa, and even the eastern provinces, a failure in one region could be compensated for by a surplus in another. The diverse and distributed nature of the empire's vineyard acted as a form of agricultural insurance. Ships carrying Spanish wine could fill the gap left by a poor Italian vintage, ensuring that the price in the markets of Rome or the rations for the legions on the Rhine remained constant. This stability was a monumental achievement of economic integration. It meant that a citizen in Rome could take for granted that his daily cup of wine would be available and affordable year after year, regardless of local disasters or political upheavals elsewhere. The Roman world had become so interconnected, so adept at moving goods and balancing supply, that it achieved a level of food and drink security that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. The provincial vineyards, once a symbol of Roman conquest, became the very foundation of the empire's enduring stability, proving that the true secret to affordable luxury was not in dominating a market, but in empowering competition across a vast and thriving network. So after hearing all that, you might be wondering, what did this incredibly cheap, mass-produced wine actually taste like? If you were to magically pour yourself a cup of the standard red vinum ordinarium from a Roman tavern, your first sip would be a shocking experience, utterly unlike any wine you can buy today. Forget the fruity, oak-aged, and carefully balanced flavors of a modern Cabernet or Merlot. This was a beverage born of necessity, and its flavor profile was a world away from the refined palates of contemporary sommeliers. First and foremost, it was thin. The relentless pressing to maximize yield meant the juice was extracted from grapes that had already given their best, resulting in a wine that was often watery in body, lacking the deep color and robust structure we associate with quality reds. This thin liquid was then almost always cut with large amounts of water, further diluting its texture and mouthfeel. It was the ancient equivalent of a budget-friendly beverage stretched to its absolute limit, a drink where you could practically taste the economics in every sip. The most dominant characteristic punching through that thin body was a bracing, mouth-puckering acidity. This wasn't the bright, zesty acidity of a Sauvignon Blanc. It was a sharp, aggressive sourness, the result of imperfect fermentation control and the very real likelihood that the wine was already on its way to turning into vinegar. Unlike modern winemakers who can carefully manage temperature and yeast strains, Roman vintners relied on the ambient conditions in their buried dolia. This often led to stuck fermentations or bacterial infections that produced high levels of volatile acidity, giving the wine a sharp, almost nail polish, remover-like tang. To our modern palates, this would register as a serious flaw, a sign of a spoiled bottle. But for the average Roman, this sharpness was just part of the standard flavor, something to be expected and, as we've seen, often corrected with a generous helping of honey or other strong flavorings. This aggressive acidity also served a practical purpose, cutting through the grease and salt of a common Roman diet based on bread, olive oil, and fermented fish sauce, making it a functional pairing for the everyday meal. Then there is the matter of resin. Just as with the Greek wine retsina today, it was incredibly common for Roman wines to carry the distinct, pungent flavor of pine. This wasn't always an intentional flavoring. It was often a byproduct of preservation. To seal the porous clay of their amphorae, Roman producers would line the interiors with pitch, a sticky substance derived from pine trees. During the long journey in a swaying ship's hold, the wine would slowly leach the flavor from this resinous lining, absorbing its sharp, turpentine-like notes. In other cases, resin was added directly to the wine itself, as it was believed to help with preservation and to cover up off flavors. So imagine that thin, acidic wine now infused with the potent aroma of a pine forest. For a Roman consumer, this was a familiar, even expected note. For us, it would be a bizarre and challenging combination, a far cry from the vanilla and toast flavors imparted by modern oak barrels. This resinated character was so standard that a wine without it might have been considered unusual or even inferior by the masses. And then we arrive at the great equalizer, the Roman solution to 1,000 vinous problems, the spice cabinet. The typical Roman tavern wasn't just a place to get a drink. It was a kind of primitive, open-air mixology bar. Lining the counter would be jars filled with herbs like thyme, rosemary, and mint, spices such as black pepper, saffron, and cumin, and syrups like the reduced grape, must called de frutum, or the infamous lead-based sweetener sapa. A customer wouldn't just order wine, they would order wine, and then the tavern keeper would custom blend it to their taste, or more likely, to mask the particular flaws of that specific amphora. Was it too sour? In went a large spoonful of honey. Was it too thin and bland? A grind of black pepper and a sprinkle of pungent laser, a now extinct giant fennel plant, would give it a kick. Did it have a funky, spoiled aroma? A heavy dose of aromatic myrrh or frankincense could cover it up. The resulting beverage was less a pure expression of the grape and more of a spiced, herbal concoction, a distant ancestor of mulled wine or vermouth. The goal was not to appreciate the subtle terroir of a vineyard, but to create a reliably palatable and functional drink from a raw material that was often harsh, unstable, and teetering on the edge of undrinkability. Ultimately, the closest modern equivalent to common Roman wine isn't found on a restaurant's wine list at all. To truly understand it, you'd have to imagine a combination of a very cheap, slightly oxidized red wine, mixed with a good splash of water, a squeeze of lemon juice for that sharp acidity, a spoonful of pine-scented cleaning product for the resinous note, and then a hefty shake of whatever dried herbs and spices you have in your kitchen cupboard, all sweetened to taste with honey or maple syrup. It was a robust, rustic, and almost utilitarian beverage designed to hydrate, provide calories, and offer a small moment of comfort, all while surviving a treacherous journey from vineyard to table. It was the taste of the Roman world itself, practical, resilient, boldly flavored, and utterly unconcerned with the delicate refinements that would come to define wine centuries later. This relentless drive for volume and affordability didn't simply vanish with the fall of the Roman Empire. Its blueprint was etched so deeply into the landscape of Europe that it would re-emerge over 1,000 years later to define the way the entire world drinks wine today. When we walk into a supermarket and pick up a bottle of inexpensive table wine from France, Spain, or Italy, we are not just buying a modern beverage. We are purchasing the direct descendant of the Roman vinum ordinarium, the culmination of an economic and agricultural model that was perfected 2 millennia ago. The scale of production, the very notion of a reliable, affordable wine for daily consumption, is a Roman legacy that survived the Dark Ages, waiting for a new world to rediscover its power. Consider the transformation of Gaul, which would become modern-day France. Before the Roman conquest, the local Gallic tribes were beer and mead drinkers. It was the Romans who identified the incredible potential of the land, particularly in the south, in regions like Gallia Narbonensis, and planted the first vast, commercial vineyards. They taught the Gauls not just how to grow grapes, but how to do so on an industrial scale, using slave labor, standardized presses, and efficient distribution. The taste for wine they created was so powerful that it outlasted Roman rule itself. Centuries later, when Charlemagne sought to revive European culture, he looked back to Roman models, and his capital, Aachen, was situated squarely in a major Roman-era wine region. The monastic orders of the Middle Ages, particularly the Benedictines and Cistercians, became the new custodians of viticulture. They preserved and expanded upon the vineyards the Romans had first established, meticulously documenting their techniques and treating winemaking as both a spiritual and economic duty. They understood, just as the Roman landowners did, that a productive vineyard was a source of wealth and stability. The famous wine regions of Burgundy and Bordeaux, whose names now signify the pinnacle of luxury, were originally developed by these monasteries. They were operating on the same foundational principle the Romans had proven: to fund a large, complex institution, you need a large, reliable, and profitable source of wine. The monastic domains were the medieval equivalent of the Roman latifundia, and they laid the administrative and territorial groundwork for the modern French wine industry, an industry built on a bedrock of Roman scale thinking. This legacy is even more vividly clear when we look at the concept of table wine itself. For the Romans, wine was a staple foodstuff, a necessary part of every meal for nearly every person. This stands in stark contrast to many other ancient cultures, where alcohol was often reserved for religious ceremonies or elite feasting. The Roman model democratized wine, turning it from a sacred or luxury item into a daily commodity. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries in Europe, and we see this exact same philosophy embedded in the lives of the working class in France, Italy, and Spain. The French laborer had his daily vin ordinaire, the Italian farmer his vino da tavola, and the Spanish worker his vino corriente. This wasn't about connoisseurship, it was about sustenance and culture. A liter of cheap wine was as standard on the dinner table as a loaf of bread, providing hydration, calories, and a small comfort at the end of a hard day. This cultural practice of daily wine consumption, so fundamental to Mediterranean life, is a direct inheritance from Rome. The modern European systems of classification, which formally categorize the vast majority of wine produced as simple table wine for local consumption, are the bureaucratic descendants of the Roman system that sorted wine into vinum primarium, secundarium, and the humble lora. They are all institutional recognitions of the same reality, that for a wine culture to thrive, it must serve the many, not just the few. The methods of achieving this affordability also bear the unmistakable stamp of Roman ingenuity. The Roman use of high-yielding, hardy grape varieties is mirrored in the history of many modern wine regions. Think of the southern French workhorse grape, Carignan, or the vast plantings of Aragon in Spain. For much of the 20th century, these were not celebrated varieties. They were chosen for the same reason the Romans selected their grapes. They produced enormous crops of decent, drinkable wine that could be sold cheaply. The Roman practice of blending, both to extend volume and to correct flaws, finds its parallel in the skill of the modern negociant, the merchant who buys wine from many different growers to create a consistent branded product. The most famous example is perhaps the wines of the Bordeaux region, which are almost always blends of different grape varieties, a practice that ensures a reliable style and volume year after year, much like a Roman merchant blending wines from different provinces to achieve a stable, marketable product. Even the Roman solution for spoiled wine lives on. The tradition of making vinegar from wine that has gone off persisted in European farmhouses for centuries, and the production of high-quality wine vinegars, particularly in Italy and France, is a direct and profitable continuation of the Roman practice of finding value even in failure. So the next time you pour a glass of a simple, affordable red with your weeknight dinner, take a moment to appreciate the incredible history in your glass. You are participating in a ritual that a Roman legionary, a medieval monk, and a 20th century Italian farmer would all recognize. The specific grapes may have changed. The containers are now glass bottles instead of clay amphorae, and the distribution happens by truck and ship rather than by ox cart and galley. But the foundational idea remains unshaken, that wine can be, and should be, a beverage for everyday life. This was the Roman Empire's most enduring and surprisingly democratic gift to the world. They proved that through scale, standardization, and a relentless focus on logistics, a luxury could be transformed into a staple. They built the first global wine market, and in doing so, they laid the cultural and economic groundwork for the wine industries that now dominate the globe. The empire may have fallen, but its taste for a good, cheap drink is one legacy that truly proved to be eternal. Of course, the idea of lead poisoning is one of the most dramatic and persistent stories we tell about the Romans, a narrative that suggests their empire quite literally drank itself into a state of madness and decay. It's a compelling, almost poetic downfall, a civilization brought low by the very pipes that carried its water and the sweeteners that flavored its wine. And it's true that the Romans had a profound and dangerous relationship with lead. They used it extensively in their revolutionary aqueduct systems, crafting massive water pipes and lining reservoirs with the soft, malleable metal. They even had a sweetening agent, as we've discussed, called sapa or defrutum, a syrup made by boiling down sour wine in lead-lined bronze pots. The chemistry is undeniable. The acetic acid in the wine would leach lead from the pot, forming lead acetate, a compound that happens to be intensely, seductively sweet. For a wealthy Roman looking to improve a harsh vintage or create a luxurious dessert wine, a dash of this syrup was a simple way to achieve a desirable flavor. The problem, of course, is that lead is a potent neurotoxin, and chronic exposure leads to a horrifying suite of symptoms: crippling abdominal pain, gout, memory loss, irritability, and infertility. There is compelling scholarly argument that the Roman elite, who consumed the most sweetened wine and lived in homes plumbed with lead pipes, may have suffered from cumulative lead poisoning, potentially contributing to the erratic behavior and political instability that marked the later empire. But when we zoom out from the marble villas of the patricians and into the crowded, dusty streets where the vast majority of Romans lived, this narrative of universal lead poisoning begins to crumble. For the common citizen, the soldier, and the slave, the people who drank the cheap wine that is the subject of our story, the risk of lead contamination from their daily drink was almost certainly far lower than popular history would have us believe. Let's start with the most obvious point: cost. Lead was a valuable commodity, mined and smelted with significant effort. Using it to line a pot or to create a complex syrup was an expensive process. The producer of a cheap, mass-market vinum ordinarium, whose entire business model was based on razor-thin margins and colossal volume, was not going to waste precious resources on an expensive additive like sapa. His goal was to produce a passable, stable product as cheaply as humanly possible. Sweetening it with costly lead syrup would have been economic suicide. For the masses, the primary sweetener was always honey, or the boiled grape must itself, cooked in far more common and cheaper ceramic or copper pots. The wine they drank was harsh and acidic, precisely because it lacked the expensive corrections that made elite wines more palatable. Furthermore, consider the entire life cycle of this common wine. From the moment the grapes were crushed, the liquid spent the vast majority of its existence in contact with one material, clay. It fermented in the massive, buried dolia, those gigantic terracotta jars that were the heart of every Roman winery. It was then shipped and stored in the ubiquitous clay amphora. Unlike the lead pipes that served the wealthy neighborhoods of Rome, clay was inert, porous, and, crucially, non-toxic. The entire distribution system for cheap wine was, in effect, a ceramic network. While a wealthy senator might have water delivered to his house through lead pipes, the tenant in a seventh-floor apartment in a Roman insula would have collected his water from a public fountain, often a lead-free stone or concrete basin, and his wine from a clay amphora in a local shop. His exposure to lead from his beverages was therefore minimal. There's another fascinating layer to this story, one that turns the common assumption about Roman wine and health completely on its head. We've talked about acidum, the sour wine that was the first stage of spoilage. While it was repurposed for cooking and for making pasca, its very existence points to a surprising health benefit of the Roman wine ecosystem. The cheap wine that people drank daily was, by its very nature, an acidic environment. This wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The Romans were living in a world without an understanding of germ theory, but through centuries of trial and error, they had stumbled upon a powerful antimicrobial principle. The combination of alcohol and, more importantly, the high acidity created by the natural fermentation process made their wine a hostile environment for many of the waterborne pathogens that plagued the ancient world. Bacteria that caused diseases like dysentery and cholera struggled to survive in a low pH, alcoholic solution. When a Roman diluted his wine with water, he wasn't just stretching his supply, he was inadvertently disinfecting that water. The acidic wine would have killed or inhibited the growth of many harmful microbes, making the resulting mixture significantly safer to drink than plain water drawn from a public well or a stagnant cistern. So, while their wine might have been sharp and rough on the palate, it was often far gentler on the gut than the available alternative. This practice of drinking diluted, acidic wine was, in its own crude way, a brilliant public health innovation that likely saved countless lives from waterborne illness, a protective benefit that far outweighed the negligible risk of lead exposure for the vast majority of the population. In the end, the entire sprawling system of Roman wine production, from the vast slave-worked vineyards to the industrial presses, and the custom-blended tavern offerings, culminated in a single, powerful act, the act of raising a cup to your lips. That simple, daily gesture was far more than just a way to quench your thirst. It was a public declaration of your place in the world. Roman society was rigidly hierarchical, and the type of wine you drank served as a liquid CV, instantly communicating your wealth, your power, and your station to everyone around you. The entire economic machine was meticulously calibrated to produce not just wine, but a perfect spectrum of beverages that mirrored the social ladder itself, ensuring that every stratum of society, from the marble palaces to the muddy army forts, had access to a version of this vital commodity, yet in a form that reinforced the established order. At the very apex of this pyramid sat the senator, the imperial courtier, or the fabulously wealthy merchant. For them, wine was an object of connoisseurship and a tool for displaying immense cultural capital. Their drink of choice was the legendary Falernian, a wine so prestigious it was often vintage dated, with some bottles aged for 60 years or more. This wasn't simply a beverage, it was a status symbol. Sipped slowly from fine glass or silver cups at lavish banquets, Falernian was celebrated for its high alcohol content, its golden hue, and its complex, aged character. It was the subject of poetry and the centerpiece of elite social rituals. But this rarefied experience was only possible because of the brutal efficiency at the bottom of the system. The very existence of a luxury like Falernian depended on the multi-press system that extracted every possible drop from the harvest. The senator's exquisite vinum primarium, that gentle, free-run juice, was a direct byproduct of the fact that the soggy pomace left over from his grapes would be brutally pressed again to create the harsher wine for the masses. His luxury was literally defined by the commonplace. Furthermore, his ability to enjoy aged wine relied on the stability afforded by the Pax Romana and the shipping networks that also carried the cheap stuff for the legions. His refined palate, in a very real sense, was subsidized by the entire empire's thirst. Just below this pinnacle, the prosperous shopkeeper, the successful artisan, or the well-to-do farmer would have consumed what we might think of as the standard drinking wine, the vinum secundarium. This was the product of the mechanical press, a darker, more astringent, and more robust liquid that formed the bulk of the wine traded in amphorae. It was the wine you would buy from a reputable merchant in the forum, the wine served at the dinners of the prosperous middle class. It was functional and enjoyable, but it lacked the pedigree and the aging potential of the elite vintages. This was the wine that was most often doctored in the taverns with honey and spices to make it more palatable, a practice that itself indicated a certain social standing. You had the small amount of disposable income to customize your drink. The affordability of this tier was made possible by the agricultural specialization of the empire and the low cost of slave labor, which kept production costs minimal. Drinking this wine marked you as a solid, respectable citizen, someone who participated fully in Roman culture, but who operated well clear of the stratospheric heights of senatorial luxury. Then we descend to the great engine of the empire, the legionary and the urban plebeian. For the common soldier on the windswept frontier of Britannia or the dockworker unloading ships in Ostia, wine was not about flavor or prestige. It was about survival. His daily ration was the sharp, acidic vinum ordinarium, often already teetering on the edge of spoilage, which he would heavily dilute with water. This was the economic core of the entire industry, the massive, relentless demand that justified the industrial-scale vineyards and the fleets of merchant ships. For the legionary, this wine ration was as crucial as his pay and his bread, a morale booster and a functional hydrator that helped stave off waterborne diseases. For the urban poor in Rome, this cheap wine, sometimes even provided for free at public fountains, was a key component of the state's strategy to maintain social order. By ensuring this basic need was met, the state bought the compliance of the volatile urban populace. The cup of the common man was filled with a wine that was direct, unpretentious, and born from the second and third pressings of the harvest, a constant reminder of his place in the economic machinery. And finally, at the very base of the pyramid, we find the true bottom of the barrel, both literally and socially. For the rural slave, the chain gang laborer on a vast agricultural estate, the daily ration was not even proper wine, but lora or posca. Lora, you'll recall, was the pitiful liquid made by soaking the already pressed grape skins and stems in water. It was thin, bitter, and nearly alcohol-free, a drink of pure subsistence that fulfilled the technical obligation of providing a wine ration at the absolute lowest conceivable cost. Posca, the mixture of sour wine and water, was the functional drink of the army and the very poor, but for the slave, it symbolized a complete lack of agency. His drink was not chosen, it was assigned. It was the final, extracted dregs of an economic system built on maximal yield and minimal humanity. Consuming lora was a daily, gustatory ritual of subjugation, a tangible sign that you existed at the very end of the line, consuming the leftovers of a system that fed an empire. In this hierarchy of beverages, the social order of Rome was perfectly distilled. From the golden Falernian of the senator to the watery lora of the enslaved field hand, every Roman knew their place, and they drank it quite clearly with every single sip. So when we piece together this entire sprawling story, from the sun-baked vineyard to the soldier's flask, a truly breathtaking picture emerges. The affordability of Roman wine wasn't the result of a single trick or one brilliant invention. It was a sophisticated, interlocking system of agricultural, economic, and logistical genius. A multifaceted approach where every element worked in concert to drive down the cost. It began with a radical transformation of the land itself, turning entire provinces into massive, specialized farms dedicated to the vine, all made possible by the safety net of imported grain. The Romans then selected not for flavor, but for brute endurance, cultivating hardy grape varieties that could survive pests and produce staggering yields. In the press house, they revealed their economic ruthlessness, methodically squeezing every single drop of value from the harvest through multiple pressings, creating a strict hierarchy of quality from the same batch of fruit. The wine itself was then volumetrically expanded through universal dilution, turning one amphora into 4 or 5, while a pantry of herbs, spices, and honey was deployed to mask the inherent flaws of a mass-produced, often unstable product. Underpinning it all was the grim engine of slave labor, a workforce maintained at subsistence level to keep operational costs unthinkably low. And finally, this ocean of liquid was moved across the known world in a flood of cheap, standardized amphorae, riding a network of protected sea lanes and stone-paved roads that turned the Mediterranean into a Roman conveyor belt. Each of these components, the scale, the grapes, the pressing, the water, the additives, the slaves, and the ships, was a crucial gear in a machine of unparalleled efficiency. Remove any one of them, and the entire system of affordable wine for millions would have collapsed. The Roman Empire, in its relentless pragmatism, understood that true power wasn't just about conquering territory. It was about managing the resources that sustained that territory. And few resources were as critical as wine. It was the caloric fuel for the legions, the safe hydration for the crowded cities, the social lubricant in the taverns, and the sacred offering on 1,000,000 household altars. This humble beverage, often sharp, sour, and doctored, was a pillar of public health, a tool of political control, and a marker of cultural identity. So the next time you think of the legions marching, the senators debating, or the crowds cheering in the Circus Maximus, remember the invisible river that flowed beneath it all. The Roman world was built and sustained not just on the strength of its legions and the wisdom of its laws, but on the vast, ever-flowing, and ingeniously cheap river of wine that kept its human engine running day after day for centuries. It's a testament to a level of logistical and economic organization that would not be seen again for over a millennium. We've uncovered so many surprising secrets behind this daily staple, from the multi-press system that sorted society by class to the use of sour wine as a safe hydration source for armies. Now we'd love to hear from you. Which of these Roman wine-making innovations or economic strategies surprised you the most? Was it the sheer scale of their production, the cleverness of their distribution, or the darker realities of their methods? Share your thoughts in the comments below.